Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel. And my guest today is Chris Mitchell, who has um, been doing this very interesting workshop for the Astrological Association's conference. And it's called Day and Night, the Joy of Sects. So, Chris, welcome.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's lovely to be here. And you're probably wondering why I'm wearing this ridiculous outfit, but it is actually a genuine one because I give lots of talks on medieval astrology. And about 15 years ago, Berkeley Castle made an outfit for me and Bernard Eccles when we gave some talks on medieval astrology. And it was made out of really heavy curtain material. And I thought I needed something lighter. And I found a lovely woman who lives round the corner from me, who used to work for the Museum of Costume in Bath and is an expert on medieval outfits. So she made me this, well, I'm only wearing the hat because it's quite a hot day today, but she made me a lovely outfit that I do wear at some of the talks and giving presentations and things like that. So I just wanted to give a bit of a medieval flavour to it. So this is the sort of hats they would have worn in medieval times. In the 12th century and so on. And my talk is about sect, which is a very medieval astrological concept.
Yes. So, what is it? What is sect?
Well, sect, we're used to the word sect in religious terms. Somebody might, Protestants and Catholics are different sects of the Christian church and so on. In astrology, sect just means daytime and nighttime. We're used to the fact that the sun is up in the sky during the day and not in the sky at night. And so you can divide the horizon, if you like, to the day into daytime and nighttime. And in medieval times, it was really important to know whether your chart was a daytime chart or a nighttime chart. If it was a daytime chart, the sun was your leading light. So there is something in sun sign astrology. But if it's a nighttime chart, your moon might be more important than your sun because the moon is your leading light. But all of the planets are on one team or the other, and the way that they behave depends on whether it's a daytime chart or a nighttime chart.
So, what happens when you have the sun and moon in their appropriate sect? So, you've got the sun in the daytime and you've got the moon in the nighttime of the chart. So, the sun is above the horizon and the moon is below the horizon. And so it's a daytime chart because obviously the sun is up, but you've also got the moon in supposedly the right place below the horizon.
Absolutely. There are actually, there's a kind of scoring system for the planets, which I'll be talking about in the workshop. But the example you just gave, yes, the sun and the moon will both be quite strong there. Of course, you might have the sun and the moon both below the horizon. But every chart is either a daytime chart or a nighttime chart. And if you were born during the day, then your diurnal planets will automatically be a little bit stronger. But it's not just the fact that you've got diurnal planets, because we've all got, all of us have a chart that's either a daytime one or a nighttime one. So we got 3 or 4 planets that are going to be strong in our charts from a sect point of view, and 3 or 4 that aren't going to be quite as strong, but they've got other saving graces as well. So we'll be looking at how you can look at a chart and decide, oh, actually, that planet's in quite good condition as far as sect is concerned, even if it might look a little bit dodgy from other viewpoints.
So you mentioned other planets here, and yet began by speaking about the lights, the sun and moon. So are you saying that other planets have an affinity for either day or night?
Absolutely. And that's what sect is all about.
So can you tell us then which planet belongs where?
I can, but I don't want to give any spoilers away for anybody coming to the workshop, because that's what I'm going to be covering in quite a lot of detail about which planets fit where and why, and to look at some examples in famous people's charts, and also, if we have time, in the charts of the people coming along to the workshop. We've got to be careful because, of course, there'll be a lot of online people as well, and we want to make sure that anybody coming to the online conference is also involved.
Indeed. So why does this matter? I can understand, it's easy to understand why it matters with the sun and the moon. Why would it matter with Venus, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter? Mercury.
Because some of those planets are, in medieval terms, better behaved in daytime charts, and some are better behaved in nighttime charts. So your Mars, for example, might be a little bit out of control in one type of chart and a little bit more focused in another type of chart. But it isn't just the placement of the planets, it gives rise to a whole load of extra techniques. We're all familiar with planetary rulership, you know, Venus rules Taurus and Libra and so on. But there's also something called triplicity rulers. There are some planets that are happier in some elements than others. And those triplicity rulers switch around a bit according to whether it's a daytime chart or a nighttime chart. So it's important for measuring the strength of planets as well. Daytime charts will have different strengths to nighttime charts. And there are some really fascinating techniques to determine what does a house mean. You know, for example, something like the ninth house has lots of different meanings, both in modern astrology and medieval astrology. It could be to do with travel, it could be to do with education or religion or faith or wisdom or science. And that's quite tricky. How do you decide which is which? You know, if you're giving career advice to somebody and it's like, well, you could become a scientist or maybe a priest or maybe a traveler, that sounds all a little bit wishy-washy and vague. So some of the Persian astrologers had great techniques for saying, I can tell you which particular area of the ninth house is going to be strengthened. And that too depends on the sect of the chart. And we'll be looking at some examples of that as well.
So what you're saying is there's more detail that can be attained in interpretation by considering the sect.
Absolutely. Yes. It just adds an extra bit of color. It's not the be all and end all, but it does add color, and it does give rise to some really interesting astrological techniques that we tend to have forgotten in modern astrology, but they add a bit of color to our palette as astrologers. And it doesn't stop me using Neptune and Pluto in my readings, but it is quite nice to throw in some of these medieval ones as well.
Well, that brings me to the next question. What are we doing with the modern planets? What are we doing with Neptune and Pluto and Uranus,
Well,
Chiron?
when I do a chart delineation, because when I first started doing astrology, I've got Pluto quite close to the ascendant, although it's out of sign. I've got Venus very closely conjunct Chiron right on the descendant. And that was the first thing that my astrology teacher noticed. It's like, oh dear, that Venus, that's a bit wounded, isn't it, there on the 7th next to Chiron and then opposing Pluto and this, that, and the other. And it all looked a bit grim. And everybody that looked at my chart when I was first doing astrology always commented on this. And I started doing the medieval astrology course with Bernadette Brady. When you start off with that, you just use the 7 traditional planets. So I could get rid of Pluto and Chiron, which is a nice thing to do sometimes. And looking at my chart, it was like, oh, actually that Venus, which I always thought was terribly wounded, it's trine the moon and it's strongly angular. How did I miss that it was trine the moon? Because it was drowned out by other things. So my approach now is when I do a chart, I just use the 7 planets, the traditional planets, and the 5 traditional aspects, and I delineate the chart like that. Then I add in maybe harmonics. I certainly add in the outer planets and Chiron. I might add in some asteroids as well. And they add color, they add to the story. But I think it's quite easy to get overwhelmed with the chart. You know, if you go into solar fire and say, add all points and all aspects, you just get this big blob that's completely uninterpretable. So I always like to start off with the basics, get the flavor of it, and then I add in that. It's like adding seasoning to your dish.
It is, and certainly looking at horary charts, I prefer to not have Pluto and Uranus and Neptune um, to begin with, at least, because otherwise it all does get very messy
Yes.
and confusing. And sometimes something that looks good, you add Pluto and it all goes bad.
Yes.
Let's pretend he's not there. So I think in some respects you've answered my question, which was how can it be viewed in modern psychological astrology terms? But I think it would be a good question then. In terms of an individual's temperament,
Mhm.
what would we say about a nighttime chart versus a daytime chart?
Well, I think, I mean, it's a very interesting point you make generally about psychological astrology and how do you incorporate this. And because I learnt with Bernadette Brady, I love her take on things, which is medieval astrology is very black and white. It's quite right wing. It's like, you know, you have to do this, you have to conform. And the analogy Bernadette always uses is imagine that you're the only person in your medieval village who has a different religion to everybody else. At best, you're going to be driven out of that community. At worst, you'll be burnt at the stake. Whereas these days, you might be the only pagan in the village, and you still get invited to the church fete to sell your crafts and things like that. And people think you're a little bit wacky, but that's fine. We're lucky enough to live in a society where you're not going to be driven out for being a little bit different. And that's how these planets in detriment and fall or out of sect and so on, they behave unconventionally. They dare to be different. And that's allowed these days. It wasn't allowed 500-600 years ago. And that's why medieval astrology comes across as very black and white. But we can assign modern meanings to this. Bernadette does, for example. The third house is about siblings in medieval astrology and modern astrology. And in medieval times, you probably had lots and lots of siblings. But these days, it would be quite common to be an only child. So who are your siblings? Well, Bernadette says, if you work in an office, your co-workers are like your siblings. The boss might be like your mother or father. And so you can use these medieval definitions and say, well, actually, these are the modern equivalents. And you can do that. And it was something that Bernard Eccles told me. He always comes up with these little gems. I told him that, like Ptolemy, he should produce his own centiloquium of the sayings of Bernard Eccles, because he always comes up with these really lovely, succinct points. And he said to me once, if you've got a client and both their lights, the sun and the moon, are below the horizon, you can look at their chart and tell them what a fantastic career they're going to have. But quite often you might find that those people are perfectly happy doing an ordinary 9 to 5 job where they feel comfortable. They're not looking for promotion. The job pays the bills. They're quite happy doing it. And they don't really want that. Yes, you can say your midheaven says you should be doing this, that, and the other. And they might be really good at it, but they probably don't want it. And just bear that in mind. You don't push a client into something they don't want. Both their lights under the horizon, maybe that isn't the sort of life that they're looking for. They get their pleasures elsewhere rather than through having to shine and having to compete and so on. And I thought that was very valuable. And I've seen that crop up over and over again.
Absolutely, because if the emphasis is on the bottom half of the chart, then you're looking at a nighttime energy, which is
Mm,
much more contemplative, much more about the inner life and the private life, rather than being out in the world. So yes, absolutely. Are we saying then that when we're looking at whether a chart is daytime or nighttime, we're doing the equivalent of looking at the shape of a chart, whether it's a bowl shape, or a locomotive or whatever? Is it that kind of flavor that we're getting?
that's a very interesting point, because yes, one of the scoring things in sect is not just whether it's a daytime or nighttime chart, but whether the planets are in the right half, whether they're above the horizon or below the horizon, or in the same half of the chart as the sun. Even if your team's not having a good day, you're still on the same side as your team. So those diurnal planets still want to hang out with the sun, even if that's below the horizon. So yes, that's a really good point, actually. The chart shapes do come into it. And maybe that's where, that's the medieval origin of what we use today as bowls and so on. So yes, that's a really good point, Anna.
Well, it just strikes me that our ancestors, we always think of them as being incredibly different to us, but they weren't.
No,
And we
right.
can only, and we can see that by virtue of the fact that we're still struggling with the same things that they were struggling
Mm,
back in Greece. There's so many issues that we're struggling with now that were alive then, because they're perennial dilemmas for how we want to view the world and be in the world. So it makes sense to me that in the same way that some people like to look at a chart and look at the shape because they're big picture kind of people, there would have been big picture kind of people
That's a
in.
really good point. Yes. I mean, when you're already using 7 planets, it's often harder to find a shape.
That's right. But this gives you a very strong overview.
Exactly, yes.
So we're adding color, we're
Mhm.
adding nuance when we bring in the outer planets and other modern things. Are we looking at fixed stars in a sect way as well?
No, that's not really related to sect. Sect really is to do with the sun. And although you could bring fixed stars into play, that's not something that I'm going to be covering on the workshop. We are sticking purely to planets on this one.
Yeah, okay. So we're looking at, well, maybe the question I wanted to ask here is, we've said that there is a modern psychological way of looking at this.
Mhm.
Does that offer anything extra to a chart if we're using modern tools and interpretations? So why would we bother learning this?
Because I think there are lots of different sorts of astrologies. Astrologers always get into arguments about the correct house system to use and things like that. But actually, what astrology is, it's the universe talking to us. And it speaks in lots of different languages. And in a way, it doesn't matter which you use, whether you use medieval astrology or Indian astrology with a different zodiac. All of this is the universe talking to us. And as astrologers, we're listening to that message, we're reading that message. And that message might be in different languages, but it's still the same message. It's still giving us information. So I think rather than saying, let's just use modern astrology and forget all the medieval ones, or let's be a medieval purist and just use the 7 planets and ignore the moderns, yeah, you will get answers that way. But why not mix and match? Why not have more colors in your palette and use modern tools and medieval tools? They both work. So why not try all of them?
They do both work. And what I really appreciate about the medieval tools is the specificity of it. You know, when you're looking at the detail that it gives you, I think that's really very useful. And I can understand why, from a modern perspective, sometimes that seems daunting because if you're reading, Lily and others, everything, as you say, is very black and white. But that's because their view of the world was different to our view. But it doesn't take away from the value of what they're actually saying. It's just that it's not palatable to us. It doesn't mean that what they're saying doesn't have truth in it or isn't true. We just don't like what we're seeing or hearing because we like to brush everything and make it all cuddly and fluffy. And sometimes life isn't cuddly and fluffy. And so we always have to have a responsibility in terms of how we deliver that to our client. But there's a detail here which is important, I think, a nuance even.
I think that's a valid point, but I do think that medieval astrology is a bit overrated in its specificity. The language used is very black and white, but the interpretations aren't. So, for example, if I follow Ptolemy, it tells me that my mother will die before my father. It also tells me, using Ptolemy again, but a different technique, that my father will die before my mother. In actual fact, my father died before my mother, but they couldn't both have been correct. But he's very black and white about if so and so, then, if X, then Y. And what that means is if X, well, there might be a tendency towards this. There might be more of an emphasis on that. And one technique that seems incredibly specific and black and white is a length of life technique, which says you are going to live to be 58 years old or whatever. But when you actually look at the technique, well, you could interpret it that way or that way, and it might be you only live to be 32, or it might be you live to be 83. So it depends which planets I use and whether I consider that to be strong or weak, and that's a bit of a judgment call. So even things that seem incredibly fatalistic aren't, because there's lots of different techniques, lots of different ways of doing it, and they do come up with different answers. Having said that, my own chart says that I will not survive weaning, and I am now fully weaned because I'm 63. But when I was 2 weeks old, I needed to have an emergency operation to save my life. And of course, that operation wouldn't have been available in medieval times. So the medieval message was kind of correct. I wouldn't have survived weaning, but a lot of modern medicine can buck the trend on things like that. Bernadette refers to it as topping up your oil. You know, it shows you how much oil you've got in your lamp, not actually how long you're going to live for. So little techniques like that. And what we have to remember with Lilly is he did thousands and thousands of readings, and the ones he put into his book were the ones that worked. And I was reminded of that when at the AA conference a few years ago, when the wonderful Martin Davis, who sadly died a couple of years ago, gave a fantastic talk on astrocartography. And he was giving all these examples. They were absolutely spot on. And we were all going, wow, isn't that amazing? And he said, you have to remember the great advantage of giving talks is I can cherry pick my examples. So the ones that don't, it doesn't, the ones that don't work, I just leave them out of the talk. And of course, Lilly and all the medieval ones did that as well. They're only going to use the examples that prove their point.
They did. And yes, when I was actually talking about specificity, I wasn't talking about that level of specificity.
Right.
I was, talking more about adding, as you said, color and detail
Mm,
to what you're actually seeing. And I'm with you on this. Interpretation is as broad as the number of people doing the interpretation
yeah.
potentially. So we always have to be aware of that we need to be careful about being too fatalistic. And that goes for modern astrology,
Mm,
because I'm sure you've come across people who've been told things that has frightened them unnecessarily. So we always need to be mindful of that. And yes, it's very easy to look at medieval astrology, traditional astrology as being very fatalistic, but actually, I see that in action in our time, where astrologers, I think there are astrologers who are very irresponsible in the way that they put information out. And I get
mm.
people phoning me up going, oh my God, I, and I have to really work then to soothe feathers and help them to put everything into perspective.
I have a friend and colleague who's now a well-known astrologer, and when she started doing astrology, she just went along to an evening class to learn it. And the teacher there had a look at her chart and said, "Oh, you've got Pluto going over your." I can't remember what it was, but there was a major Pluto transit going on. Everyone said, "Oh dear, so are you feeling? How are you feeling? And has something? Have you had parents die, or have you had relationships break up?" And she was like, got a bit scared, and she said, "No, everything seems to be fine." Well, has anything dramatic happened recently? No, she said, all I've done is started coming along to an evening class in astrology. Well, of course, that utterly transformed her life in a very positive way. But when that seed was planted, it was like, yeah, I'm just coming along to an evening class. So it's no big deal. Of course, it was a huge deal, but she didn't realize it at the time. So that was Pluto in action, but without the nasty stuff. It just really did transform everything she did in the future, but it wasn't obvious. And often, huge oak trees aren't noticeable when there's just a little tiny shoot from the acorn. So we have to be aware of that in astrology, that a transit might not immediately show up, or any of the predictive techniques. They might be really important in retrospect, but you can't necessarily spot them at the time. As astrologers, we're much better at post-diction than we are at prediction.
In fact, that brings me to a very good question, which is, what role does sect play when in prediction?
Um, Not a major one, really. I tend to think that, I mean, in horror, you might say, well, actually, that planet is a little bit stronger because it scores well from a sect point of view. I see it far more as a natal technique, really, to sum up the sort of person that somebody is, their personality, how they react to situations. I don't think it's a major tool in prediction. I don't think that sect is a vitally important thing generally. I think it's the seasoning on in as an astrological technique. I wouldn't start with sect. I'd throw it into the mix and see what it tastes like.
So now, is there going to be a recording available of this talk or workshop?
Absolutely, yes, yeah. Anyone coming to the conference will have access to the video recording for 30 days, and you can also buy the audio recording with all the PowerPoint slides, and that's yours to keep. That's an audio recording that you keep forever. But you could also, if you've signed up to the conference, you get access to the video recording as well.
Okay, well, that's rather important, as this conversation is going to be viewed post workshop
Yes.
conference. So this is very important. So how can people get a hold of the recording, Chris?
If you go to the AA website, and there's a shop on there on the top menu, and one of those is called recordings, and that will give you you can just buy all the audio recordings. I think it's £10 for a half-day workshop, £5 for an ordinary 1-hour talk. And what you get with that is an MP3 file that you can play on any computer. It's not protected or anything like that, so you can play it on any device. And for all the conferences in the last few years, you also get the slides that go with it. Because the recordings go right back to the 1980s, some of the earlier ones are just audio recordings that were transcribed, that were copied from cassette tape, and there's no images to go with them because they were just hand drawn on acetate slides in those days. But the more recent ones, you get the slides to go with it, which helps, because it can be quite frustrating when you're listening to an audio and somebody says, wow, look at that chart there, look at that bowl, and it's like, what bowl? I can't see the chart. Whereas if you've got the slides in front of you, you can.
Wonderful. I'll be putting a link to that in the description box. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's been a pleasure as always.
And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be looking at ascendants. Until then, goodbye.
Bye-bye.